Welcome to another episode of the Agronomy Highlights podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ryan Spelman, and I'm joined here with my co-host and wonderful colleague, Justin Brackenrich. Justin, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good today, Ryan. How about yourself?
Justin, I'm living the dream again.
Good, good.
And yeah, that's right. The sun's shining, and we get to talk about silage today. So I guess we'll jump straight into it. So I know for me, this is kind of one of the more exciting things this time of year, right? We start to see the green up of some of our forage crops, like we talked in our earlier episode, right? Once we get kind of our stand counts done, we can start to see a lot of growth in some of our early small grains. And then one of the first products to come out of our field is small grain silage. So it's kind of a fun opportunity, and it's always cool to see the combines out early. So we're going to kind of cover small grain silage and talk about some inoculants today. What do you think?
I'll tell you a story. When I moved here from West Virginia, if you listen to the podcast regularly, you know I grew up in West Virginia. One of the biggest things that I like is a hurdle or like this mental barrier was that we were burning down all of these cover crops and there weren't fences around our fields. And I got up here and there was all of these cover crops, all these things, and they're like, when do we put the cows in here? Like, when do we start baling this hay? When do we start doing something with this? Like, no, 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 that's not what we do with this. We burn it down, we leave it there. The nutrients go back in the soil. And it took me a very long time to like wrap my head around that concept because to me, is a forage person and a livestock person, like I just kept seeing all of these like tons of forage that I thought like, let's just wrap it up. Let's feed it to them. Let's pick up their manure and we'll put it right back where it came from, right? Like this is almost just too perfect to not do. And so it really encouraging me to continue down this path and that we're getting to this point of we're cover cropping in the fall. We're holding our soils. We're getting the biological activity. We're getting the fixation. We're keeping down our leaching. But now we have something to kind of get this animal agriculture back in our systems. We're getting these forages off. And so we're starting down this, and how do we do it better, right? That's where we're at today. Is we're making the progress, we're looking towards it, and we've got an expert with us that's been with us before about silage, and he's going to tell us how we can do it better. So Ryan, what do you think? You ready?
Yeah. Before we invite him on, I just wanted to say it's funny you bring up that story because I had the exact opposite experience when I started my role as an agronomist. Because as my role as a researcher, I studied a lot of cover cropping systems, and we were using a bunch of unique cover crops. And then burning them down, right? So I just kind of figured that's how it was done. Then in this current role, I moved to a dairy area, and I started seeing, everything that was in the field was going to feed their cattle, and it was they're basically doing corn for silage, then planting a rye or a triticale, harvesting that for silage, then back to corn for silage, and the productivity just really impressed me. So that's all I have to say. Um,
Perspective.
yeah, it's funny. Two opposite
Yeah.
perspectives, but it's just a testament to how many cool things we can do out in our fields, right? And how we can integrate animal agriculture into everything that we do as an agronomist, which we're kind of trying to get more of in this podcast, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, anyways, well, Justin kind of alluded to it. Our guest today is upgraded now to friend of the show. He's been here before. We talked to him about corn silage earlier this year. We kind of took some notes on the 2024 season and applied it to kind of what to expect in corn silage in the fall and what we can learn for following years. And so our guest today is Joe Lawrence. He's the Dairy Forage Systems Specialist with Pro Dairy at Cornell. So Joe, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, guys. It's fun to be here.
So
And
so Joe, the first question: triticale or triticale? Well, just
I'm a,
come
tr-
out of the gate, come out hot. What you got?
I guess I'm a triticale guy, but I don't know
Okay.
if that's right or wrong.
I it
That's my New York dialect, right?
That's
So
okay. So maybe that's where I get it from. So New York, West Virginia, somewhere I skipped Pennsylvania when I picked up my language habits. So
Yeah, I'm the odd one out. I say triticale.
well, that's all right. We'll keep working on you. Maybe we can get you turned around here.
That's right.
So let's start with this, right? So today we're going to do small grains. We're going to start with this kind of review and introduction to small grains and silage and what we're doing with them. We're going to finish with kind of these big questions of what are inoculants that we use with these? How do we use them? When do we use them? Kind of etc. But first, when you think of small grain silage, what are the crops that first come into your mind?
Well, yeah, you guys talked about you came into the jobs with different perspectives, and coming from New York, we have some different challenges just in terms of the length of our growing season and fitting some of these crops in. So I've learned quite a bit from farms and colleagues in Pennsylvania, and being much more aggressive with this practice, and sometimes it's just part of a result of just the length of growing season we have, right? And when stuff starts greening up in the spring, um, as well as when we can get it planted in the fall. So when we start thinking about the small grain silages, um, the the biggest part of that topic these days is around winter grains. So mostly winter rye or winter triticale or triticale, right? We're planting them after corn silage for some of their benefits as a cover crop, but then, can we utilize them as a double crop and get a spring forage off of there? Probably should also mention, we use stuff like spring oats as a potential small grain silage as well, either in a more traditional time frame with a spring planting and harvest in early summer, or like in August, we'll do some August planting of oats, especially like if it's been a challenging year for forages and we need some extra production in the fall, we can plant them in August and 45 days later get a decent crop of cutting a silage as, maybe an emergency forage or something like that. But
I
I
think
think
that
probably
that's like
we'll
a great point to put in there because I guess in my mind, when I think of small grain silage, it's always just this like winter cereal, right?
Mhm.
Something that's planted after silage or something like that that we take off, or some early beans and we take it off again before we plant our cash crop the following year. I guess it never really occurred to me, or I've never put a lot of thought into the idea of a spring planting that we can take off, or that like August emergency forage. So there are lots of different ways you can think of this, apparently.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, it can different ones can fit, uh, and those timings of the year are unique, right? And may help a farm out in a certain situation. One thing that I think is common with the winter cereals as a double crop is that crunch time in the spring. Again, if you're the further south you go, the earlier spring green up is, and maybe you get a little more of a window there, but it doesn't matter if you're in New York or Pennsylvania, right? Spring's a busy time of year. And on dairy farm, we're trying to get manure out onto the fields for our nutrient management. We have corn to plant. We're gearing up. If we still have perennial hay crops in the mix, we're gearing up for first cutting of those. And then if we're throwing another pretty significant task of harvesting this small grain silage into the mix, we have to make sure we're doing it it's worked into our plan that we're not sacrificing on the other side, right? If we're not, we're not sacrificing the planting date of our corn to get this harvested, and planting our corn late, which sets us back for the rest of the season. If we're still growing perennial forages, we're not sacrificing our first cutting and the quality of that, because that can be a very high quality feed for our cows too, right? So regardless of the size farm or how we're integrating them, we just need to, one commonality is making sure we have a plan for tackling that spring workload without sacrificing in other areas.
Yeah, so maybe this is a good place to ask a question about what are we looking for when it comes to small grains in the growth stage or the moisture when we do decide, right? You're talking about how we have a lot of farm activities going on and we have this narrow window, if we're talking about silage, right? When we're talking about it this fall, there's a really narrow window when the corn's at the right moisture, the right NDF values, those kinds of things to harvest for silage. Is it kind of the same idea with these small grains? And what are maybe some of the things that we want to be looking for it's time to fit this into our schedule?
Yeah, it comes back to our goals, right? But if we're talking dairy quality feed, then there's the old saying with any sort of grasses, which are small grains or grasses, of once you see the head, the quality's dead. So we're really looking for that flag leaf stage, where that last leaf that comes out before head emergence, as dairy quality feed. Now I say that, and just a couple weeks ago I was had an opportunity to be at a program, and that was actually a Pennsylvania dairy farmer that told me I was wrong with that growth stage. So, and he had his reasons, and he had a different system that was working for him. So I guess I bring that up just to, as there's different ways to tackle this for depending on what your goals are, right? But if our outcome is dairy quality feed, we're going to get the best digestibility, the best fiber digestibility, the protein levels out of that feed if we're getting it before it heads out. And in some cases, because it's such a fast growing crop and the tonnage can be so high, and we have these huge windrows, right? And small grains tend to be kind of have a waxy leaf texture that makes them a little harder to dry in the windrow than even some of our perennial hay crops. And so we end up with these massive windrows in and of a material that doesn't dry well. And if we're in the spring of the year, we're also sometimes cutting this on a wet soil surface, right? So I do know some farms that have actually moved up their planting date. They're sacrificing a little bit of yield, but the trade-off is it's a more manageable size windrow that dries a little better. Also, maybe cutting at a little higher stubble height to keep that windrow up off of that moist ground. Again, a little higher stubble height, you're giving up a little bit of yield, but I like to say that our goal isn't, our measure of success isn't the yield that comes off the field. It's the yield, it's the tonnage that makes it in front of the cow as quality feed, right? So if we take a bigger tonnage off of the field, but it doesn't ferment well, and we have a lot of spoilage losses, and not all of that makes it to the cow, we haven't really gained anything. So I tend to be a proponent of managing things at the field level to make sure we're going to have a really good high quality silage. And then in those cases, we can actually have more of the higher tonnage reach the cow's mouth than if we had tried to maximize the tonnage coming out of the field, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So it's great that you brought that up, like spoilage and kind of alluding to shrink and the things that come along with some of this stuff, and not just what's in the field, but what we actually see in front of the cow. Is there a difference in that, and how do you see this being stored and how that affects some of that quality, right? I think upright silos are kind of going away a little bit, maybe a lot of bit, right? Maybe that's an understatement. But what do you see as most of your producers using as how they store this and how it affects its quality?
Yeah, it is still a mix. I mean, we do have pockets and certain audiences that are still using upright silos or ag bags, right? Or we could put this up as baleage, but certainly a lot more bunk silos. So in general, our baleage and our upright silos, we are going to want to try to get it a little drier into, the high 30s dry matter content, where our bunk silos, we may be in the mid 30s, 33, 35%. We might be able to get away with a little better in our bunk silos. And that comes down to wilting, right? Different than our discussion on corn silage, where we're leaving the corn silage out in the field till it's at the right dry matter. It's mowing this crop, which is probably only going to be 18-20% dry matter as it stands in the field. And so we're trying to dry it down another 15 points post mowing to get it to where we want it to chop it in and silo it. And but yeah, the upright silos, the baleage is going to need to be a little drier for us.
And I can speak a little bit from experience that I've worked with producers, and I've done some research this year on grass hay and stuff. Is one of our biggest challenges is making this quality. So I'm in Western Pennsylvania, but a big challenge we have is getting that wilt or getting that dry down early, right?
Mhm.
And maybe this is a little context difference because we're talking about getting to 35% dry matter, that 65% moisture mark. But when we're really looking at these premium quality hays and stuff, a lot of that occurs for us in like Labor Day, right? Right around the end of May, 1st of June. And most of the time, we are like 55, 60 degrees and overcast, right? And like a
Yeah.
75, 80% humidity, threatening rain all the time.
Yeah.
And so, like, then you have to start making these decisions of, do I gamble on being able to dry this? Do I start investing in this baleage technology or something like that? Or do we let it go a little bit longer, right? Because once we
Mhm.
move into June, by the middle of June, typically we clear out some clouds, we get some heat, but now we've gone into that next stage of heading and we've lost a lot of quality. And so kind of back to what you were saying of fitting your system, you have to know your weather in your region, and it's really important that you understand that of what you're going to get come springtime.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's farms that specifically wait to post heading for, if they're going to feed it just to young stock or heifers, right? And they have a separate storage structure on the farm where they're going to put that for heifers or something. And so they will wait. But again, if we're trying to capture that really high digestible stuff for our high producing dairy cows, it's um we're we want it early, and the sacrifice of missing that is pretty significant. So
So one thing that I'll just want to in this conversation that I want to touch on before we kind of move towards inoculants in this conversation is, eh, do you have any tips for folks on how to properly measure the moisture? Because it seems like our biggest problem with, as we're talking about grain silage, is the moisture level, right? Drying it down enough. Every time you go to a farmer, they have a different way that they wrap it around their fingers and they say if it's ready or not. Do you have any technical responses for that, or recommendations on how to know it when it's ready to go in the bunk?
unfortunately, no, I have yet to come across anything that's real handy. And even a lot of the like portable moisture probes are really only meant for dry hay, right? I mean, we have moisture probes that we can use in the windrow or in a bale for dry hay, but if you look at their moisture range that they're calibrated for, it doesn't include our silages. So no, outside of just those farmers that have just decades of experience and that knowledge, still comes back to, grabbing a sample out of a windrow, drying it down on a Coster tester or something like that if you want to get real technical about it. Unfortunately, that it takes some time, right? And not everyone is is willing to do that, but it's still a good way to get a good sample, and making sure it's a representative sample so that, back to windrow management, right? If we're laying those windrows out wide, so the little bit of sun we are getting that time of year is hitting more of it, and we have a more uniform drying process versus having that really tight, big windrow where it might be getting dry and crispy on the outside if we have a good drying day, but it's still sopping wet in the middle, right? And so trying to get a good uniform drying and getting a representative sample if we are going to go to the effort of doing an actual dry matter on a Coster tester or something. So,
Sure. So if you don't have the ability to test the dry matter or the desire to, find someone who's been doing it a long time and learn from them what to look for and adopt their feelings for it.
I
yeah.
would tell you to use caution before you start drying hay samples in your wife's microwave. You can do it, but she doesn't appreciate it as much as you might think she would.
And in all seriousness, for safety, actually put like a coffee cup with some water in it. It seems counterintuitive, but to prevent fires from happening, you can dry the sample, and with a cup with a little bit of water, it'll prevent it from catching on fire.
Yeah, there's some
Um,
good resources on that. We'll make sure we get a link in the show notes for anybody that's interested in how you dry your stuff down with a
yeah.
Coster tester or with a microwave tester.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to jump ahead to our other topic, but as we think about fermentation too, and what we need for fermentation is a lot of sugar and energy for those bacteria, right? And I'm not necessarily recommending this as a practice, but there is some research that's been done that shows that you can, if you ensile a wet forage immediately after mowing it, there's so much more sugar there and available that you can actually still get a pretty good fermentation without it turning like butyric on you or something with a much wetter forage than we would normally suggest. And the reason being is because the longer you leave that out there in the windrow and it's still moist, that plant's still respiring in the windrow after it's been cut off, and that process is burning off the sugars, and those sugars that we're burning off by leaving it in the windrow for a long period of time are the same ones the bacteria want to help ferment it. So there is this trade-off that if you are stuck against a weather window and you're concerned about it, if you're, if you mow it and less than 24 hours later you're going out there and ensiling it and there's still a lot of sugar in there and you're using an inoculant to help or something, then you can get a good fermentation, but it can go wrong on you. And on the flip side, that's where we see if something gets rained on and you leave it out in the windrow for several days trying to dry it back down, and you think you've gotten it dry, but then you ensile it and the fermentation still doesn't go well and it goes butyric on you. Part of that is because even though you left it out there after the rain to dry back out, you burn off so much of that sugar that there's just not a lot of feedstock there for the good bacteria to do the fermentation process.
I think that's one of those really good points that we often kind of miss, right? Is there has to be sugar for fermentation, right? We have to have the bacteria that we need for fermentation. And if you are lacking all of these things or you don't have enough to complete all of it, what we see is a really bad or an incomplete fermentation process, right? And all of this is very important. And I would embarrass myself if I tried to give my synopsis of all of the steps and the acids and the things produced in front of you. But we end up halfway through this process or not being able to get our pH down and all of the things that we need when we don't have all of the right pieces of this in place, right?
Mm. Yeah, yeah. I mean, coming from the agronomy side, we often talk about the disease triangle, right? And the three factors you need. Well, there's a silage triangle too, and it's essentially, well, it's kind of four things, but the three sides of the triangle are a
It's the
bacteria.
silage square, perhaps.
Yeah, yeah. The way they write it, or the way I've seen it portrayed, as a triangle with sugar, bacteria, and acids, and then inside the triangle is H2O. So because you need moisture for fermentation too. So that's but yeah, so it's a similar concept to our disease triangle, is we need certain things to be in place for this to happen or not happen, right? So
Pulling up the silage triangle so I can envision this and seeing it. I'm checking your work here. So we have these environmental elements, right, of the forage that we want to make sure are in good standing, right? Our moisture levels and our sugar levels, and maybe we can start talking about inoculants here. So could you maybe clearly define what an inoculant is and how it interacts with our forages or our small grains in this case?
yeah, so I mean, if we want to step back, really, these are silage additives to enhance the fermentation process or help us preserve that feed, right? And when we in common kind of lingo, when we talk about inoculants, we're really talking about bacterial inoculants that are a living bacteria that you're putting in to kind of essentially help the naturally occurring process, right? But just real quick, we can mention too, there are other options. We use stuff like propionic acid to help preserve feeds and stuff, which is a different process. That's essentially trying to stop any biological activity in it versus fermentation and these bacterial inoculants, which are trying to use nature, use biology, and just adding extra so that coming out of the field, these crops can ferment on their own. people have been doing that for centuries. But if we add these extra, if we inoculate, right, with an extra dose of the good bacteria, we can aid that process.
And so I want to actually, before you said that, I was Googling when the first ensiling occurred. And there's some really old, maybe conflicting, but most of this is saying the Egyptians were ensiling stuff like 1,000 to 1,500 BC. So a very, very long time ago, we were figuring out this process and working on it. But I want you to elaborate on what you said a little bit of we can add this to make the process better, or um, are we making it more stable? Are we making it better for the animals? I mean, we've been doing this a very long time. Why now are these additives such an important part of this process?
Yeah, it's right. So, and I think this might be a good time to bring up too that inoculants won't fix bad silage or other management challenges. So if it is way too wet or it's been rained on or it's over mature, we're not going to fix that with inoculant, but we can enhance the natural process. And it, it it really just comes down to, in some ways, to me, to economics. We can rely on nature to, and it's been doing it for thousands of years or forever, right, of fermenting this product. Um, but when we look at the investment we've made in it, the importance of it to feeding our dairy or livestock, if we can give ourselves a bit of an insurance policy that the process is going to go better and we're tipping the scales in the favor of a good fermentation process, and that economically works out, right, then it's we're like I said, we're tipping the scales more in our favor. And I would say, I'm mid-career and not haven't been around forever, but if I can think back kind of 20 years to some of this stuff, and 20 years ago at a lot of extension meetings and stuff, questions about inoculants, it was like, well, it depends, or there's some research out there that shows they might work, but there's not a huge, it's a hard topic to research, and there's not a huge body of evidence. And fast forward to today, and I would argue that it's common practice, and it should be common practice on farms, just what I would say is standard operating procedure. And because over time there's been some researchers and that have done a lot of work, and the body of evidence has grown, and inoculants don't, you don't actually see a specific outcome in every single case where you use them, but in the big picture of things, using them year in, year out, the odds are in your favor that more often than not that they're going to enhance your fermentation process.
So I guess your recommendation here would be use them all the time then?
Yeah, there's nuances to which ones to use, but in today's world with the value of our silages and the options that are on the market, that they're a good practice. A certain type is a good practice to use all the time. Then we can get into more of the nuances of, what makes the most sense to use when.
Cool. Yeah. So I guess and it makes sense, right? Like if you think of other fermented products, we could even think of beer or wine, right? If we leave it up to nature, it'll ferment, but depending on different factors, you might get a sour beer, right? Or something like that. But if we control the yeast strain that we use, we can ferment for all different kinds of beer or wine. So maybe
Mhm.
it's kind of a same idea here. And maybe that's a good way to kind of think about some of the different types of inoculants and what they do. So I guess that's probably, maybe we can jump into that then. So you kind of mentioned that there's different types and you might use different types in different situations. So, could you maybe define what some of the main types are?
Yeah, there's a lot of diversity of different bacterias that have been discovered on the market today, but in the basic sense, there's homofermentative products, and these are going to produce a lactic acid essentially. So they're basically using sugar from the forage as their energy source from the forage and producing lactic acid, which is desirable for a fermentation and to drop that pH to get that efficient fermentation and stable forage. So those are, what we tend to call our front end inoculants in silage world of, those are going to help with the upfront fermentation process because the fermentation process is using energy from the forage, there's a certain amount of loss associated with that, where we're actually converting energy that otherwise could have been nutrition for the cow. We're converting it into CO2 and some acids and stuff as to get our fermentation. So the longer that goes on and the more essentially dry matter that the cow could have consumed gets burned up in an inefficient fermentation process. So if we can add this inoculant, add these extra bacteria, improve the efficiency and the speed of our fermentation process, we're preserving more of those tons of dry matter nutrients for the animal instead of for the bacteria. So that's the homofermentative side. And then the fermenters, they actually they still start with the same sugar, but they, instead of producing the lactic acids, they produce a lot of times like one lactic acid and one acetic acid plus some CO2 or ethanol can be produced and as another byproduct. And so these can be less efficient, but they can work as what we call a back end inoculant. And this is where the most common one you'll hear about is L-buchneri as a what we would call a back end inoculant, which isn't so much helping with the upfront fermentation, but it's helping with stability at feed out. So some farms will use these back-end inoculants all the time, but there is an added cost to it. And if we think about where we really desire stability at feed out, our biggest threats are going to be during the hot summer months. If we're feeding off the big face of a bunk during the hot summer months, if we have a crop that was under stress and harvest just didn't go well, and so we're already suspecting it might be a a little bit compromised going into storage, then maybe we would want to think about that extra stability at feed out. If we have a bunk face that's too big, generally we want to try to feed 10 or 12 inches off the face of our bunk every day, but sometimes we end up with a really wide bunk feeding a smaller group of animals, and we're especially in the summer months, but even in the winter, if we're not removing enough off of that face every day, we can end up getting heating. So maybe we want to utilize one of these products to get that extra stability in those cases. So I don't think there's really anything wrong with using them on all your forages, other than there is a cost to that. But you can also, if you have certain storages that you're feeding out at a certain time of year, again, the heat of the summer or something like that, then maybe you can think about it a little bit more strategically of where you do and don't use those back end products.
So I'm going to try and summarize this a little bit and ask you a question. So as the homo fermenters, what we're looking at is they're going to help us do it faster. The heteros are going to help us kind of keep the spoilage to a minimum. And if we're looking at this as someone that's like maybe their face is sized just right, or even if they're baling and wrapping something like this, spoilage may not be one of their bigger concerns, right? They may be looking at this from the angle of, I don't have enough surplus feed now. What I need to do is accelerate this ensiling process as quick as possible so that I can start feeding yesterday, right? Well, there's a time process and all that goes, but that's their objective. That's when the homo fermenters is the most important part to this. Is that correct? Maybe I'm simplifying it
Yeah.
too much.
No, that's right. And again, in the common terms these days are our front end products versus our
Okay.
back end products, right? So in there are some inoculants on the market now that are specifically designed if you do need to feed out a forage sooner than you would have hoped to get a good stable fermentation. But in general, it's going to be as much about preserving extra dry matter and getting a better more stable product than it is about that it's gonna make, several weeks difference on when I can start feeding this out. That's just not really a reality. I mean, it might gain you a few days, but not weeks. But again, there's a lot of products on the market now. There are ones that are marketed specifically for feeds that you're going to have to feed out sooner than you'd hope to. There's ones different moisture ranges, so now it's really important. And even like corn silage, which is high in starch and has a lot of energy there, versus like hay crop silage, which especially like alfalfas tend to be a little harder to ferment anyway. So now they've catered these products where there's different options for hay crops that are dry or wetter versus a one you'd use for a corn silage. And that's where, from an extension standpoint, there's just so much out there that we don't really get into one over the other. It's just working with your industry representative to make sure you're getting the product that most closely matches your forage system, the type of crop it is, the type of storage structure you have, that kind of stuff.
So one of the biggest questions I get surrounding this is either with people wrapping hay and they want to wrap it wetter than what they should because they want to do it all in one day, or when we start getting into the September, October, and we're doing silage and it's either too wet or too dry. The question is, will one of these inoculums help with this? It doesn't sound like the answer to that is either a front end or a back end type product. It sounds like it's a totally different product that they should be working with an industry representative and talking to them and saying, hey, here's my situation.
Well, yeah, it's going to be a front end product in
Okay.
generic terms, but it's going to be one that's dialed into
Okay.
those. So it's going to be a front end product in the big sense, but more dialed into those specific conditions, based on what the companies have to offer.
Okay, great. I think so. I think and maybe this is good for me too, right? I'm trying to wrap my head around all of these components to this. Front end is just a large umbrella term for all of these things that fit in there that are working kind of immediately to help
Yeah,
stabilize,
yeah,
right? And then they have a suite of products that kind of fit within this category of front end. Then that's where you're going to control moisture, you're going to accelerate fermentation and stability, you're going to do all
hmm
that kind of stuff versus the suite of products that may be the back end things that are going to help you with a more stable product once you open and start feeding.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. All right.
Well, here's one question that I have. When we're talking about these front end and back end products, we've kind of talked about how they work separately and are doing different things, right? Are they something that you would think could be used on one silage product, or usually if you're using a front end and it does a good job, you don't need to worry about the back end, right? Because
No,
you used up all the sugar, or does it not really
yeah.
matter?
No, there's definitely combination products. So they come, I mean, you can get one or the other, but there's ones that specifically are pre-mixed as a combination product. And so there's definitely scenarios. I would say, so back to my previous statement, I would say the front end ones are the ones that I think as an industry we should just be using universally now. And so always use the front end and then decide, again, some people would say use the back end across everything, and I wouldn't necessarily argue with that. I think you just got to pencil it out for yourself. But again, also think about the specific sets of criteria where the back end. So you're always using the front end, and then you get that combination product for those scenarios where you want to have that back end stability too.
We like nice summary things with action items. And I think that was it, right? That was the distillation we were looking for of if you're going to be doing this, you're always going to probably be happy with this, always probably going to be happy. You're going to benefit from the front end inoculum, right? The back
Mhm.
end is the one that you need to pencil out and make sure that it's making sense economically to your operation.
Yeah.
Perfect. So my next question is, so say we've converted someone, we've convinced them to get into this, they want to do it. How are these things applied, right? If we're talking about a silo, we can, I've seen the old videos or the old pictures where people are kind of shaking powder over stuff where it's coming out of the wagon and blowing up into the silo. How are we applying these things now if we're talking about grains, but small grains before they're going into a bunk or a bag or something like that?
That's an excellent topic because that is a huge part of it. And these are only as good as if you get them evenly distributed across the product. So I was that teenager growing up on the farm that my father gave me the little bucket of the dry inoculant, and I'd climb into the self-unloading wagon and throw it on the top of the wagon before we blew it up the silo, right? And looking back on that today, I mean, the idea that we could do that and really get good distribution of that product throughout all of that silage is probably questionable, right? And so it really is about even distribution of the products onto the silage. So ideally, one of the best places on a modern chopper is right on the chute of the chopper, because then you got a small stream of material coming through that chute that's getting the inoculant put on it before, as it's going into the dump truck or the wagon or whatever, right? And so that's really a great place to start, is trying to get that uniform coverage. And we're also using low volume products, especially on the liquid side, right? We don't want to be refilling this thing every couple acres. We can't stop the chopper every couple acres. So companies have innovated with these low volume applicators that it's just a small amount of the inoculant mixed in with water just being sprayed on the silage. So there's convenience to low volume, but it also means we have to be that much more precise on getting it onto the material, right? So a lot of it is in management of getting it onto the material. If you can't get it on at the chopper, it's really tough in a bunk. If you're going through an ag bag or an upright silo, then going through the ag bagger or the blower on the silo is another place where you could have a applicator set up, as the silage is dumped onto the tray of the ag bag, or even on the as a round baler is picked on the pickup head on a round baler. You could be putting it on there. But again, you want it evenly distributed. So throwing it on top of a bunk silo or on top of a load of feed is really not going to be a very sound practice in terms of getting this product to work well for you.
Yeah, so it seems like it really depends. Well, we say this every episode. It depends, and every place we go, we say it depends. But based on your method, you're gonna have to find a good way to integrate it. And it sounds like you kind of have some creative options there. Is there a good way to like measure the amount of inoculum that you're applying? Is that an important piece of this as well?
Yeah, for sure. So there's actually two parts of that. Going back to when you buy it is CFUs, or colony forming units, are a measure of the concentration of the actual live bacteria in these. So that's a one to start with. That's a good thing to look at when you're buying a product, because if you're price shopping, sometimes these products are more diluted out, have a lower CFU per gram of the material. And so you could be thinking you're getting a better price, but you could actually have to put on double the rate to get what you need, right? So that should be right on the package of the inoculant, what the concentration is, and then there'd be directions there if it's a liquid inoculant of how much water to mix that with to get that concentration that you need. So we're not really like taking these to a lab and testing what's there. We're just relying on that, legally the companies have to report what's there, right? And that there has to be a label on the product that is giving us that information and the directions on how to mix it. So yeah, there's not a commonality because it's going to change by product. It's really just about following the directions of the product.
And I assume, so when we talk about like soybean inoculums or clover inoculums or something, like we're always really careful to remind people of like, remember, this is a living bacteria. Don't go somewhere and buy this bag just somewhere and throw it in the truck and ride around with it, or like put it in the planter and leave it sit out there in the sun for days on end and expect it. I assume handling is also very important with this too.
Absolutely, that's an excellent point. And not only where do we handle it or how do we handle it before we mix it up, but also I've seen scenarios where we have these liquid applicators and little pumps with hoses that spray it onto the silage on the chopper. And I've seen scenarios where they mount those containers too close to where the engine is, and they get superheated. Right. So a lot of times, and the companies that have been really innovative with this, they have like, the orange igloo coolers like you'd use on the sideline of a sporting event, right? And even maybe even putting some ice or something or mixing it with a colder water, and if it's going to be out on the chopper all day long type of thing, or if you get finished chopping for the day and you have some left, draining it out and putting it in the refrigerator overnight or something like that. So they have recommendations and protocols for that. But yeah, um, it is a living material. You can cook it on the dash of a truck if it gets left there in the sun, just like our soybean inoculant. And you can also, potentially kill it even after you mix it up into solution if we're not careful on where we situate it on the chopper and that sort of thing.
This discussion is really grabbing my fascination. I don't know if it's the element of MacGyvering that kind of makes these inoculants work, and it seems like it really forces some creativity on how you're going to effectively use them and such. So, I guess one question from that is, if I'm a farmer, right, and I know these silage additives, these inoculants are out there, are there any really good resources that you have to recommend for me to sift through the different products available, or is this one of those products that's really good to find a local rep that you trust, a company that makes these specifically, and really rely on those the folks they have there?
Yeah, I mean, there's some general information. So Dr. Lehman Kung, who's now retired from the University of Delaware, was a leader for many years in silage fermentation and evaluating inoculants. So if you just Google his name or silage in the University of Delaware, you can find a lot of basic information. Yeah, there's so many products out there on the market that we don't have like in our agronomy guide where we have all the herbicides, right? And the rates of the common. Or at least I'm not aware of something like that for the silage inoculants. But the companies do have really good resources. So if you're, again, finding a reputable company and making sure their product is, again, not price shopping, but making sure the product is contains these. So maybe to back up a little bit, maybe one thing is some of these fact sheets and articles from someone like Dr. Kung at Delaware, they give you some of the names of the most common bacterias that are found in these and stuff. So if you really wanted to dig into it or you didn't have a local supplier that you were comfortable with, you could start there and get as a a list of the most commonly used bacterias and how they function and which ones work better than others, and then you could use that to reach out to a representative. But once you've made contact with the company, um, they have some really good resources. I know several of the large companies have shared with me where they have little one pagers or two pagers that list all of their products, and specifically in bullet point form, very easy to look at, highlight whether it's for hay crops or corn, or if it's for low moisture crops or high moisture crops. And so they have some really nice comparative tables of their own products that help you decide which one is going to work best for your situation.
Awesome, cool. Well, I think kind of talking about some of those resources available to folks, and I think it's a good point that just like with herbicides, we're always talking about the chemical names. That's a really good point to kind of look at some of the research from Dr. Kung, especially as you mentioned, and pick some of those bacterias and look at the different, and I'd imagine a lot of them are going to be kind of similar mixes of different bacterias across the board. So I think that's a really good point. We're going to move towards a close here. So Joe, is there anything else that you want to mention that we maybe didn't cover about silage inoculums that's important here?
Well, I think I just go back to that coverage and application part and following the directions, right? We're not going to do ourselves any favors by trying to put a half rate on. or something like that. And whether it's like a propionic acid we're using on dry hay or dry corn or something, or a bacterial inoculant, there's specific calculations and specific concentrations that are known to work. So just making sure um you're following those directions to get the most out of the products, and just some simple operations and maintenance stuff. I mean, I've arrived on farms that are in the middle of chopping a crop and only to find that a corn stalk hit the hose coming from the tank to the little spray nozzle applicator for the inoculant, and the inoculant's just dribbling out the hose onto the ground instead of making it to the spray nozzle, or the hose is plugged up and they've been chopping for 10 hours, and all of a sudden they look in the igloo cooler, and the level of liquid in there hasn't dropped at all day long, right? So just um these these products are only as good as making sure they get applied right, and that all the equipment's working properly.
Sure, yeah, that's a good point. I can imagine if you're especially if you're not used to using these inoculums, you're not really looking for it, right? So
Mhm.
if you're just going through your process, I need to chop this silage, and usually, like we talked about earlier, you have a small window to do this, right? Spring is a busy time, and it can be really, really easy to overlook some of those things. So if you're gonna use it right,
Mhm.
and apply it so that it's effective, and make sure that you're keeping an eye on it. Well, Justin, do you have anything else to pitch here?
Yeah, so as always, I'm Googling over here, listening to this one was such a good one for me. Right now, I'm gonna have to do a deep dive on all of the available front end and back end silage inoculants. But one thing I do want to comment and kind of keep in perspective to people is I looked at quite a few of these while we were talking. Application rates are something like a gram per ton, right? And they're saying like a quart to 2 quarts of water too. Right. So I think that's something we have to put in perspective if we're often used to spraying or we're thinking of our nozzles at home or stuff. And I know Joe talked about like we want low dose and we want stuff. We don't want these great big tanks. This is a very different system than we may be talking about with like 20 gallons to the acre or something like that, right? Like this is something that we're going to have to think about. And there are probably specialized systems
Yeah.
designed to go to this low of a dosage and how we mix to get to that type of a rate. So I hope maybe that puts it in a better kind of frame of reference for people rather than they're thinking about, well, if I'm already wet on my silage, why would I want to be spraying more water on it, right? I mean, it's not that much water.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good analogies there. I would, whether it's the soybean inoculums or these rates. So the companies have been really innovative, and then sometimes I don't want to get myself in trouble with offering something, but you'll find where some companies will actually offer an incentive program where they might give you a rebate on part of the cost of an applicator if you buy the inoculants from them. So they're looking to set you up for success too, right? Like they want their products to be positioned to work as good as possible. And I was thinking of the analogy too of like a plugged line. I mean, I'm sure we can think of those situations like with dry fertilizer on a corn planter that you plant 5 acres and you expect the hoppers to be empty, and you go back and realize they're gummed up with fertilizer, the auger's gummed up or a chain popped off, and you just planted 5 acres without putting on the starter fertilizer you thought you were, right? And that's the same thing with just taking that time. It's hard to stop the chopper when things are going well, but just, making those adjustments, taking that time once in a while to make sure everything's still working correctly in the middle of a long day. Because you can put a lot of tons per hour through a chopper, right? And if you think you've been inoculating this forage all day long and all of a sudden you've been chopping for 10 or 12 hours and found out that you haven't been putting it on, that's a fair amount of feed that's now in your silo that's not hasn't been treated, right? So
Yeah, sure. That's a good point, and can be applied to a lot of field operations, especially as we get into the time of year where we're going to be putting a lot of hours in the tractor. So, I think that's been a great discussion on inoculants. I know me and Justin have been kind of messaging in the background saying, "Wow, I have like 20 more questions, but we don't have the time to ask them all." So Joe, it was great to have you on. Yeah, there's a lot to learn here. So we appreciate you coming on and walking us through all of this.
Yeah, no, it's been a lot of fun, and hopefully there were some good messages that come out of it. So
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks again, Joe. And for our listeners, thank you guys for tuning in, and we'll see you on another episode of the Agronomy Highlights podcast.